don't play this deck. You have been warned. So, this is 49 card Gagarin versus Kate. Even though it's not a museum deck, I can tell you this deck isn't really fun to play, even when you win. You have been warned. Anyway, let's begin by installing 2 tour guides on centrals. That's a very solid start, especially against Kate. If she's not running Parasite, she can be in a lot of trouble. Now, we get a pack campaign going, and we do have an Expo Grid in hand, so that is actually pretty lovely. My opponent, on the other hand, counters with an Astrolabe, which is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting this matchup. My opponent runs R&D, and I choose not to res the tour guide here, because my R&D agenda density is okay, it's not the worst, but more importantly, I want to save the R&D res for when my opponent plays a high impact card like Indexing or R&D Interface. For now, getting single accesses isn't the worst, so I happily allow my opponent to do so. Now I ice up the pack campaign. My opponent gets decent money going with the gambles early on, so I actually do need to protect the pack campaign here. If my opponent destroys the pack campaign, sets her back very far, 5 credits, but it also causes me to lose 2 drip credits per turn, because Export Grid doesn't fire, pack campaign doesn't fire, and I really want to protect that basic economy, given that I haven't found Banker's Group early on. Now I continue solidifying R&D here because my opponent reveals that they're playing Diaper, which some of you might not know, but it's basically DDoS combined with False Echo to get through R&D in one hyper turn using keyholes and notorieties to win in one single turn. So R&D defense is absolutely paramount. At this point, I'm not even going to attempt advancing the Changeling that's on R&D, because it's going to get bounced back by False Echo anyway. Now my opponent attempts to run HQ, which is interesting, because I put an upgrade in there. My opponent runs HQ, so I do res the tour guide here. I don't res any of my other assets because I run Lakshmi Smart Fibers. Lakshmi is a card that only works when you have other things to res. It doesn't gain power counters unless you res other stuff. So you need to leave a couple of assets and upgrades unres on the table, and that's where the Christian Grid on HQ comes in. That's when my Unrest Jackson in Server 2 comes in. Now, I found Double Oaktown, or rather I found Fast Track Oaktown, so I'm going to Fast Track for an Oaktown and advance it in the open to confuse my opponent. Oh my gosh, you run through the entire card pool and ask myself, what on earth is this guy doing? What on earth could he be possibly threatening? He must be thinking of mid-seasons right here. And truth be told, a mid-seasons will make a film critic to counter the mid-seasons will make me very sad right now. But I'm going to test the water, force out the film critic if he does run it. He plays the hyperdriver, so I kind of interesting. So hopefully she doesn't have a solution to this, but oh man, this is just hilarious. If I play this in person, I really wish I played this in person, because I would love to see my opponent's reaction to this. Like, what on earth? Naked open agenda and it's not even possibly a trap. It's clearly an agenda. It's a face-up agenda. It's Oaktown. My opponent dirty laundries it, and I show the Lakshmi. Joke's on you. Well, that's a wasted run. Not really wasted for my opponent, because they do still get dirty laundry money. They choose not to access the Oaktown, so they don't lose the credit. But that still works out in my favor. I'm going to be able to score the Oaktown next turn. However, I do have other considerations. If I score the Oaktown next turn, my opponent will very likely trash my Lakshmi, which is not exactly what I want. I want the Lakshmi to stick on the table. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ice up the Lakshmi with a very annoying piece of ice, the Assassin. I am rich enough to res it because my opponent let me get the pack campaign going. Then I'm also going to ice up the Oaktown. Reason being, if my opponent decides to steal my agenda here, I can res the ice that's protecting the Oaktown to gain 1 power counter on Lakshmi, bringing my Lakshmi count to 2, in conjunction with the Christian Grid that I just res on my turn. So this allows me to actually defend the Oaktown for another turn, should I need to. Now my opponent runs HQ, and this is where things get really dicey. If my opponent hits the Oaktown in my hand, I am not able to use Lakshmi to reveal Oaktown. I can't reveal it right now because I only have 1 power counter on Lakshmi. So my opponent, if she hits the Oaktown, she could swing over to my Oaktown server, run it, and steal the other Oaktown for 4 points total. That would be devastating, but instead my opponent simply trashes the Christian Grid, which is a very suspicious move. I told you I was suspecting Diaper, I was expecting Keyhole on R&D. That deck doesn't really care about Christian on HQ, aside from having to block notoriety. So the fact that my opponent destroyed the Christian on HQ with a vengeance, the fact that my opponent was so intent on running HQ and accessing my upgrade, was a sign to me that my opponent was on something other than Keyhole. So being very wary of that, I stacked another piece of ice on HQ. My opponent brings out the Mimic, which is quite important. That is probably her only breaker for Tour Guide. So given that, I think a very good plan right now is to find more assets and asset spam my way out. I do find my Indian Union Stock Exchange, which is going to be very good economy in this deck. About half my cards are out of faction cards, including Lakshmi, the Jackson, and a lot of ice. I'm running a lot of neutral ice, such as Assassin, Cobra, Enigma, and these all add up to a lot of money when combined with Union Stock Exchange. And you can see that I have Subliminal Message in hand as well. So that is a card that will give me 2 credits every turn my opponent fails to make a run. Very, very impactful. So let's get that out of the way. We play the Subliminal for 2 credits. And at this point I'm going to advance the Changeling because now I suspect that my opponent's not on Keyhole. So the Changeling on R&D should do some good work. Strength 4 Sentry is what a lot of Shapers do not like. It's why Newshound is so good against Shaper. They can't use Deus Ex or Sharpshooter to get through it, so that basically forces out the Artman 4, which is very good. This means that that's an Artman that's not on 5 for Assassin. Now I continue spamming out assets, trying to bluff the Atlas because my opponent hasn't been face checking my assets at all. So hopefully I can score the Atlas to get up to 4 points, at which point a single global food would give me the win. Now my opponent goes for the big turn, the big Diaper turn, going up to 11 clicks in conjunction with Beth Kilring Chang. Beth is very, very good in these combo shaper decks. So my opponent goes for HQ, and at this point, I basically realized what was up. My opponent was attempting to Apocalypse me. It's not Fear the Masses, because my opponent will be playing Fear the Masses at this point otherwise, and has shown too much influence. So basically the only possibility at this point is Apocalypse and Notoriety. Apocalypse looks very likely at this point. My opponent plays a Utopia shard after making a successful run HQ. And very interesting. I can see why. Pops the Utopia shard and swings over to Archives to attempt to get my agenda. I shuffle it back in with Jackson. I make a mistake here. I should shuffle the Fast Track back in. Fast Track's a very key card to enable Lakshmi shenanigans. So, successful run on HQ and Archives. All she needs is a successful run on R&D, but she's down to 3 credits after spending so much money to break my tour guide on HQ. My opponent realizes that I didn't rest the last card in my remote and went for it. Yeah, that was a dead giveaway. Maybe I shouldn't have res any of my other 2 cards at all. That was a very obvious clue that the card in the new remote wasn't an asset. And if it isn't an asset, it's probably an agenda that I'm trying to sneak out. So my opponent sniffed it out at the right turn, the exact 1 turn that he needed to. Now, she attempts to run my R&D after clicking for a couple of credits and sees the bad news. It's Assassin into Changeling. The Assassin snipes the Mimic, so even if my opponent gets past the Changeling, which she cannot because she needs 8 credits to get the Artman 4 out, she still needs to deal with the Tour Guide at the bottom of the remote, and that's where I completely lock her out. She failed on her big turn, and when you are a combo deck with Apocalypse, you've used up all your hyperdrivers, they are not coming back to your deck, and you fail to make the Apocalypse, you kind of lose the game. So after this point, I'm basically just gonna fast advance the video. Fast advance. Yeah. Because this game was a very slow, long, grindy one. I tried to score agendas, but the agendas just weren't turning up even though I was drawing with Jackson. My Lakshmi got up to a ridiculous number of counters and my opponent could not contest it, but I still couldn't find the agendas. I couldn't find 2 agendas to score Lakshmi with. And yeah, it just went on for a very long time. I wasn't even intentionally grinding up my opponent. That's the way the cards worked out. So my opponent was just basically clicking for credits and trying to get to a good enough credit level to perform the Apocalypse. But with Tour Guides and my assets getting out of control, the chances of my opponent getting through were very slim. Coupled with the fact that I was starting to advance my ice wall because I really had nothing better to do with my clicks. I have nearly 50 credits. I just can't find the agendas to win me the game. So the best thing I could do was to tax out the Inti. And 6 strength ice wall makes it very difficult for my opponent. Now she needs an Artman 4 for the Changeling, Artman 5 for the Assassin, Artman 6 for the ice wall. That's not going to happen. I finally find the window to Lakshmi. I get the Oak Town in the remote. My opponent attempts to contest it. I res the Cobra. My opponent has no good answer to the Core Barrage. She could tutor the Mimic with Clone Chip, but that's a very bad choice because that's her last Clone Chip. So instead, I snipe off Apocalypse, Indexing, and basically cripple my opponent from here. My opponent did run Levy, but it was sniped off by the Assassin on the R&D run. So eventually, my opponent conceded because there really was no way out. Even though the Lakshmi was trash and that denied me my win condition, I could basically just grind the game out slowly but surely. So I don't have much to offer when it comes to talking about making big plays this game. However, I'd like to focus more on the meta call and deck building aspect of this deck. Why play Lakshmi? When you look at the card, you ask yourself what are the hard counters available on the runner side? And you see two big standouts, Imp and Film Critic. The former is not something you worry about anymore. With the new Most Wanted list and the recent data packs, Noise just isn't that good anymore because Tag Storm cripples Noise so hard and they just don't have the influence to play their Wild Sides, their Files, their Davids, and their Aesops and the Caches anymore. As for other Anarchs, they would rather play Rebirth Kim if they want to destroy operations rather than play Imp. Because Imp can easily be purged and it takes up memory. So you almost never see any Imp nowadays. So that's not a hard counter that you need to worry about. Film Critic, however, is a different story because it does see some play. However, most players use it with Infection. There's not much reason to splash it. So for the Infection runners, which are Shapers, you do have a counter for it, which is Contract Killer. Contract Killer works very well against Shapers because Shapers don't usually check the remotes. So you can leave one on the table and then double advance the next turn and pop it to trash their Film Critic, and they usually have no way to recur it, giving you a window to score your agendas with Lakshmi. Another aspect of talking about decks is how do you build a Lakshmi deck? Now that you've found a card that is good for the meta, Lakshmi fares pretty well in this meta compared to when it was first released. Now, how do you build a deck around it? Firstly, you have to consider the agenda suite, which is the most important part about playing with Lakshmi. Because you need the double agenda, you need one in hand and one on the table to enable Lakshmi. So you want to have as many duplicate agendas as possible. For that, the best agenda suite by far would be the 333, 222, 222 agenda suite, where the numbers are, so that means you run 3 of each, one 3-pointer, one 2-pointer, and another 2-pointer. Your 3-pointer should almost always be Global Food because that allows you to win on 3 agendas while the opponent is forced to win on 4, and also negates the fact that you are going up from 20 agenda points, which is the minimum you need, to 21. You also need a sufficient number of reservoir cards because Lakshmi only is effective when it has at least 2 power counters on it, and for power counters to be added to it, you need to res cards. So Ice doesn't count because you cannot res Ice voluntarily. You need assets and or upgrades to enable Lakshmi. Finally, keep in mind that Lakshmi is 3 influence. Wayland's pretty starved for influence. I had to spend most of my influence in this Gagarin deck on Lakshmi, leaving me with very few other influence for tricks and ice. So this is why this deck is just not that good. Maybe you can think of a better deck than me. Share it with me if you can find one. Until then, thanks for watching and happy net running. Goodbye.